Please join us for part 1 with our guest, Michael Ben Zehabe, published author currently working on his next project, Ruth, a new translation and commentary.
We're so happy that we've got Michael here and Albin here. Michael and I have been corresponding for the last few months about this. I do feel like I've made a friend, Michael. We have definitely made friends over this. This has been a very, very fun project. So just by way of introduction, we have Michael Ben Zehabe as a guest today. He is from Santa Monica, California. And he has written nonfiction, such as The Mathematical Structure of Ecclesiastes, The Semitic Tales, a commentary on Jonah, The Meaning of Hebrew Letters, Song of Songs for Daughters, and has received and written numerous award-winning novels such as Unassimilated, Persianality, Zonked Out, and more. His syndicated column, Plug into the Universe, is for an audience with no previous knowledge of Hebrew, but wonder how it influences their spirituality. He has been a guest speaker at various organizations, a guest on radio. He has appeared on television and written extensively on the holy language. So we are just so happy, Michael, and you were so kind to give us 20 pages of the first draft of your book on Ruth. We have just loved it and talked about it since you gave it to us. And I think I shared with you, we spent last Shabbat studying the book of Ruth most of the day. So we're all familiar with Ruth. We just so excited and we will enjoy hearing you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I love fellow students of Holy Text. So as I mentioned to you, I'm just a fellow student. I'm as anxious to hear your feedback as probably you are to hear my feedback.
Very great. What brought you into an interest in writing a commentary on Ruth, Michael?
Well, first of all, I was kind of in between books, and it was just such a short book. I just thought I'd have a look at it. So I just started doing a little bit of translating. And right away, I noticed quite a few mathematical anomalies. And that in the original Hebrew, those things just are not supposed to happen. So I'll just mention a few without mentioning the pillars that we'll be discussing in detail. But in the opening, I think it's pretty obvious. I think every scribe knows that there's 4,947 letters. You have to get every letter in there, or that's 1,294 words or 85 verses or 4 chapters. But it was the 85 verses that first caught my attention. Of the 85, 77 started with a vav. Obviously, 7 is a messianic number, and 77 is more of an elevated kingly number. So that got my attention. So then I wondered what the other verses would mean if I just started with the first letter, since there's no vav, starting those verses. And that's where I came to my first discovery, that I just thought it was odd that the 8 verses that do not start with a vav, they begin in order with the letters Yod, Shin, Ayin, Yod, Beit, Aleph, He, Lamed. And basically what that means is my deliverer is in the tent. And that's where I remembered something that I heard from Elihu Rips. He gave me this bit of advice for the book of Ruth. He said that there are 4 instances where deliverer is hidden in Bible code. So that I knew before my publicist, Zoe Greenfield, contacted your organization, because she did have some questions, and Elihu Rips is no longer doing private Bible codes. And he just suggested that I take a look at that. And that's kind of what got me started with the Bible codes.
That's really awesome. And it was very interesting to read about all of the verses that begin with the Wah.
Yes, there's 77 of those. And I just kind of threw them out. I went with the remaining first letters. And that's where, I got that connection once again with Redeemer? Why is that so prominent in the book of Ruth? Why does that keep coming up? And that's why I wanted to dig deeper.
Yeah, that was amazing. My deliverer's in the tent. I recall us talking about that quite a bit.
Yes. Of course, that did lead me, especially after speaking with Terry about pillars. She saw 2 pillars in the Bible code. And I didn't tell her at the time, but I also discovered some mathematics connecting those pillars. And it had to do with a word that has to do with a cubit and maidservant. It's exactly the same word. So why is maidservant and why is cubit in the Hebrew the exact same spelling? And that brought me back to the pillars before the temple of Solomon, where one was named Boaz, and then there was this other pillar too. Whenever you add up those pillars, it comes to a number that is the exact generations between Ruth and the Messiah Jesus. So I just found that interesting. It's like at this point, it's pretty much undeniable that the cubits or the maidservants between the two form the exact number of cubits for Solomon's temple.
Wow.
Just astonishing.
And how many generations was that, Michael?
Yes, generations, actually, which, obviously the Hebrew word teledot has to do with generations. That would be between the maidservant and Ruth and Jesus. But the interesting thing about that is in Genesis, the first time the word teledot is used, it's spelled correctly and properly. And as I was taught at yeshiva, after that, teledot is spelled incorrectly through the rest of the Bible. And their explanation is because the generations were imperfect, that like teledot is missing the vav in teledot. But the original use has a vav. So with the missing vavs, they figured, well, since vav is also the number 6, and 6 is a man's number, man was imperfect thereafter. So naturally, Yahuwah would misspell teledot because of imperfect mankind, all generations thereafter. So here we are. All of a sudden, I discover it's not misspelled in the book of Ruth. So it is misspelled, it is spelled correctly the first time it's used, and it's misspelled everywhere in between, and then again spelled correctly in the book of Ruth. What's the connection there?
So in the book of Ruth, the first time it's spelled correctly, and the complete spelling, and the last time the complete spelling?
No, in the entire Torah.
Okay.
Teledot is misspelled except for the first use in Genesis.
Right. And then in Ruth, it's there one time in the complete spelling?
Yes, and all of a sudden, the Bible starts spelling teledot correctly.
Wow.
It's beautiful.
That's amazing.
It's just beautiful.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's really amazing.
And so the 45 generations to Jesus brings us to, is that where Boaz comes in as a kinsman and a redeemer, as Jesus were?
Yes, and he too is described as a kinsman redeemer. So I guess you could say prophetically, he is like the greater Jesus, the greater Yeshua.
Yeah, and it was obvious in the book also that Boaz was big about using the name of Yahuwah in the book to barak people.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there is this myth that God's people do not use the holy name of God because it's so sacred. That's just not true. You won't find that anywhere in the Bible. Even Eve used God's holy name. I've heard it said that like the first time you get the holy name of God in actual usage is whenever it's revealed to Moses. That's just silly. Eve used it before Moses. And remember Moses' mother's name? Her name had the holy name of God within her name. So how could Moses' mother's have a name with the sacred name in it, but Moses does not know the name, the holy name of God? It's just absolutely silly. And as you said, Boaz uses the holy name of God just in common parlance as he's speaking to his servants.
Yeah. When he goes out and blesses them in the field.
Absolutely.
That seemed to be a real point in the book, that he uses the name. I think that was a couple of times that was said, that he uses the name, his name or the name.
Yeah, and it's not spoken of as anything unusual or anything interesting. And I think you'll find other biblical characters doing the same thing. But the book of Ruth, since that's what we're discussing right now, that's just one more proof the holy name of God was in common usage at the time of Boaz, and actually at the time of Yeshua.
Wow. What is your thoughts on the Greek and the Aramaic?
I really have no opinion on that. It's not the holy language.
Yeah.
So obviously the first books from the disciples of Jesus were written in Hebrew because there was no such thing other than Hebrew Christians. They didn't exist. Jesus certainly didn't go to the nations, and he said so specifically, I came to the house of Israel, and he even refused to speak to any Gentiles. So if all there were Hebrews, Jews. So if one Jew was going to write to another Jew, they're going to do so in Hebrew. And whenever they sent out the first missionaries, those missionaries were Jews being sent to other lands. So who formed those first churches? That would be the original apostles or disciples of Yahushua. So it would be one Jew writing to another Jew. No doubt they did so in the original Hebrew, the sacred language. But thereafter, they were free to translate to whatever common language there was. There's certainly no sin against that. As a matter of fact, it's desired. That's why I translate Hebrew to English for English speakers. You don't have to speak Hebrew to find favor with Yahuwah. I mean, you can speak Chinese as far as that. I'm sure that there's Chinese that don't know a word of Hebrew, don't know a word of English, and Yahuwah likes them better than he likes me. It's not the language that's separating them from favor with God. Their behavior is enough. So I'm not an advocate that every human being needs to speak Hebrew. I just think that it helps, and I'm happy to encourage and help those people if they want to speak Hebrew, the sacred language of God.
And if Jesus was a pure Jew, then that would mean that his words would be written maybe in the ancient Hebrew in his day.
Well, he didn't write anything.
The authors of the Jewish Gospels.
Yeah, so you have what's left with his disciples relating the stories of their experience with Jesus. And again, that would be Jews writing to Jews, helping them to form congregations in lands of Gentiles. So it would be one Jew writing to another Jew. If there were any disputes about what was proper, what was improper, they didn't go to Greece to settle these disputes. They went to Jerusalem. And that's the way things were conducted until the destruction of Solomon's temple in 70 AD.
And that is in reference to Acts 15, when the apostles and older men went up to Jerusalem.
In the dispute over circumcision?
Yeah.
If there were any disputes, they would go to Jerusalem to work out those disputes because that's where headquarters was.
When you study the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, what do you study? What source do you use?
I kind of avoid the New Testament as much as possible. Everything you need to know is in the first letter of Holy Text. If you don't get it after the first letter, that's okay, because everything you need to know about holy text is in the first word. If you don't get it in the first word, that's okay, because you'll get it in the first sentence. If you don't get it in the first sentence, that's okay. You'll get it in the first chapter. If you still don't get it, that's okay. You'll get it in the first book. But we have a very generous, very loving God. So he kept going, 66 books. And I do believe that all 66 books are inspired by God. But since I have no original Hebrew to go by in the New Testament, we're out of my specialty, we're out of my territory. So I don't speak with authority on anything in the New Testament. Anything prior to that, I can speak with authority, but I'm not a Greek scholar, and I don't care to be a Greek scholar. I see that as a pig's language, basically. Hebrew is the holy language of God, and that's where I'm very happy in. Keep me in Hebrew, that's good enough for me.
Thank you very much. Terry, did you have some other questions you want to ask?
I do. A quick one. Do you believe that this story took place during a Moed?
Well, the story actually takes place about 1090, and that's really not too hard to deduce. I mean, you can go to United Nations statistics to see how long a generation is. And today, a modern generation, they consider to be about 22 years, something like that on average. Now, I accept the fact that it may have been a little longer back in Ruth's day. So I estimated it could be anywhere from 22 to 40. And that's where I come up with an average number of 1090. So that would place this event right around just after Samson.
Because it speaks so much of the harvest, the wheat and barley harvest, do you feel like it was around any agricultural appointed times?
Oh, definitely. Well, you have the new year, Nisan, is whenever you have your first crops. And that's where you have references made to the first fruits. And of course, that would be your barley, wheat, and there's a few other crops that come at that time. That would be your first crops. But like, I'm using barley as a very strong reference here because it does state later on, they arrive before the barley harvest.
Mhm.
And you have Nisan 14, the Passover. One of the indicators of the time of Passover is that the barley, that the seed is green. So not only is the seed formed, but now it's green and it's almost ready for harvest. So I'm assuming that they celebrated Passover and Moab, and then they walked over to Bethlehem. And after they arrived, the barley harvest started. Thus, the whole Boaz story, where he is harvesting barley.
Yeah, interesting, because it talks about a meal. And talking about dates and numbers, can you tell us what age you feel like Naomi was, Ruth was, and Boaz were?
You know, I would only be speculating because it's not stated specifically, but according to Naomi's own words, that she was beyond the age of bearing children. So, I mean, we have an upper end for her, but, you know, she could still be young, just unable to bear children. So there's quite a range you could go with there. Boaz, I don't really know how old he was. He was older than Ruth. He was a man of substance. He was a responsible man, respected by the elders. He had a seat at the gate in the community. So obviously he was a responsible man in a responsible position. I wouldn't consider him ancient. He was probably older, probably responsible, but generally men phased out of positions of responsibility after age 50. You certainly weren't allowed to serve as a priest in the temple after age 50. That was forced retirement. You got to go. So I don't know, maybe he was around that age, just before 50, maybe about 40 to 50. That's a pretty reasonable guess. But of course, Ruth herself women married young back then. And I'm guessing that she was a teenager when she married, and her husband died fairly quick. So she was probably still in her teens, if not her early 20s. And that would be a range for Ruth, anywhere between, I'm guessing, 18 and 22, right around there.
Mm-hmm. In our studies, we were a little bit stumped. We were studying about Naomi, where it says she was a nurse to the child, and we studied the word nurse, and we really couldn't get if she was literally nursing the son or if she was acting in a grandmother type teaching, nurturing. It was a little bit confusing to us. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, there's a difference between nurse and wet nurse.
Okay.
She was not a wet nurse.
Okay, that's what we thought. It was just in studying the words, it was kind of a question that we had among us. Was that possible? So
Yeah, because
thank you.
brings up bosom. Show the child to her bosom.
Yeah, and that is actually straight out of, I love that verse. That is straight out of a Jesus parable, where he gave the illustration of the rich man and Lazarus. And he described that this Lazarus was in the bosom position of Abraham. Well, that doesn't mean that Abraham was his wet nurse.
Okay.
Bosom, and as a matter of fact, that comes up quite a bit throughout the book of Ruth. And in my translation, I use the word bosomer, because that also speaks to a very, very mistranslated word in Holy Text. And that is El Shaddai. That is a very badly translated word. The word for bosom is Shad. And the word for God is El Shaddai. The Yod at the end would be me or mine. So that would be God is my bosomer. Well, that fits right in once again with Jesus's parable, that like Lazarus was in the bosom position of Abraham because Abraham was in the bosom position of El Shaddai. It was Abraham where the word El Shaddai was used for the first time. So just as Abraham was in the bosom position, Yahuwah, we have now Lazarus in the bosom position of Yahuwah. Now that does not mean that like Abraham had been resurrected to heaven and was with Yahuwah. Of course, that's silly because Jesus is the first fruits to heaven. So they were dead in the ground waiting for a resurrection. And I don't even know if Lazarus was a real person, probably not. But certainly Abraham had not been resurrected to heaven. That would put him ahead of Jesus. And Jesus is the first fruits to heaven. Thus, Nicene 14 would be part of those first fruits, and Jesus would be part of those first fruits. That's why Passover exists at that time period. So it all ties together. I mean, all 66 books are intricately connected, and it doesn't take a lot of digging to figure that out. I mean, the same language, the same words, the same numbers, the same holidays that are being kept. It's all informative. It's informing you so that you could understand what Yahuwah's purpose is from beginning to end. In Genesis, Yahuwah loses his family. In Revelation, Yahuwah gets his family back from beginning to end.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. One more question, please, that I have. It seems like this business transaction or legal transaction took place at the city gate, and he was an elder of the city. Did he function in a judging capacity? I'm trying to figure out who was judge during that time.
That's a good question. He was not a judge. Judge, obviously, it means deliverer. So we're getting back to redeemer and deliverer. And that's the word that keeps coming up in the subtext in some of the equidistant letter skips that I I already knew about, where it's the equidistant letter skips appears in 4 different places in the book of Ruth. That is for redeemer and deliverer or judge. You could say that like Boaz was a deliverer, he was a redeemer, he was an elder in the community, a responsible man at the gates. And this did take place whenever there were no kings. This was during the time of judges, but the last judge had already died. Samson was the last judge, which is a very interesting fact if you'll think about it. If Samson, being the 13th judge, if he died, why does the book of Judges go on another 4 chapters? Like, why not stop Judges at the death of Samson? Like, do we really need these other chapters? Why don't we tear them out of the Bible and throw them away? They must be there for some reason whenever there's no more judges. I think one of the reasons being is there is a connection. It does establish that there's 2 tabernacles, one that Yahuwah approves of, and the other one that he does not. And the disapproved tabernacle, the one in the north that was established with the 30 silver pieces that was received by the death of Samson, Delilah got for betraying him. But remember, Shimshon is the word for son. The son connects us. Shemesh, son, and Shon, the last letter being Nun, is a connector. Whereas you have Delilah, Lila, being the Hebrew word for night, and the beginning Dalet, the letter Dalet, is yet another word for door in Hebrew. So Delilah is like the door to night. Samson is the connection to the sun. So that is the purpose of those 4 additional chapters, leading us very beautifully to the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth leads us beautifully to the birth of the Messiah.
And so you and I have discussed in the past that when the last judge died, the book continues with the activities that are things they did while they were alive.
Yeah, minus the last judge.
Minus the last judge, right? And also you back up again to the bosom position. Remember, John was the beloved apostle, and it says that he was in the bosom of the Christ.
Yes, actually, I didn't think to bring that up, and I probably should mention that in the book too. Thank you, Alvin.
Yeah.
Put that down. John Bosom. That will be an addition.
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat what you all were saying
Go ahead.
about John?
Alvin.
So John was the beloved apostle, and in the account, it says that John occupied the bosom position of his master. Well, maybe they were so close, so maybe while they were reclining at the table, John would have sort of leaned in, you lean in when you to your wife, or a husband leans into, or your daughter leans into you, and you cradle them in your bosom position. And so John was also in the bosom position of the Christ as a beloved apostle.
El Shaddai.
Right.
You have to think like a Hebrew for all this to make sense, and get away from a nurse and wet nurse. It's like once you're in a bosom position, it shows that you've been accepted. You're in the blessed community, in the family of Yahuwah. And whereas Naomi really wasn't all that receptive to Ruth, it even tells her to go back to Moab. Certainly not the kind of thing a good Israelite should do, but she was not embracing of Ruth, but yet she was embracing to the offspring of Ruth, and thus the lineage to the Messiah. So there was a reconciliation.
Right, and to that about the son that was born to Ruth, the account says that the neighbors, her friends and families said a child that Naomi has born a son. But it wasn't because she cared for the son. Like when Mary, when the angel said to her, the son that would be born. And that meant that Mary now was responsible for Jesus, right? So she cared for him just as Naomi would have cared for the young child.
And in that same verse, notice that the angel gives the maidservant, Mary, instructions on what to name that child.
Yeah.
Now, when you name something, it shows ownership, such as whenever Abraham dug wells in Israel, he named those wells because he owned those wells. Now, as soon as the enemies came into Israel, they took possession of those wells. They renamed those wells because it showed ownership for them. Now, they claimed that they owned it. So just as Abram was given a new name, and remember who gave him his new name, Yahuwah. So you have Yahuwah naming Abram, Abraham. He also renamed Sarah. So whenever you have God naming something, it shows possession, it shows ownership. So when the community gave Ruth's son a name, that was their way of claiming him, that they owned him. And that's why you get all these different names. Solomon had about 7 different names. It all depends on who's claiming him and who's claiming ownership. And it's not that there's a dispute, it's just that they all love Solomon. And so they all have different names for him. No doubt the community had a name. Maybe Ruth was okay with the name. Maybe she wasn't. She may have had a different name for it. But that seems to be the name that stuck through Taladot, through the generations, down to the Messiah, because those are the names we find in the book of Matthew, in the generations.
And another account where the bosom position reflects, you remember Abishag, who lay in the king's bosom to give him warmth,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
and he was old, and as the older you get, your body does not heat up as a youth who has vibrancy built in. And it says that Abishag would lay in the king's bosom to provide him warmth, not in the sense of they didn't have any intercourse or sexual relations, but she was just like a live blanket to him. So she lay in his bosom.
Well, she was, in fact, a proper wife. If there's any dispute over that, just ask Solomon's older brother, who asked for Abishag. And it was such an insult that Solomon put him to death because his response was, what's next, the kingship? Because whenever a king such as David, and I'm not disputing you, Alvin, you're exactly right. I'm just adding another dimension to it. David never had sex, never had intercourse with Abishag, but she was his proper wife and needed to be respected as such. And if anybody did not, it could cost them their life because she had an elevated position. She was not just something. She was the wife of David. And the importance of it being distinguished that she never had sex with David was for the purpose whenever Solomon inherited her along with all of the other wives of King David, not that he would have sex with the wives of David, but legally he could with Abishag, because not only was she younger than him or close to the same age, but they were already connected and she had never had sex with David, thus making her marriageable to King Solomon. And if you remember, who was the most beautiful woman in all of Israel? Abishag. So thus, that gives us the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. That is based on Abishag and her coming into the household of Solomon. Thus, the Shunammite, because that's where Abishag was from, she's from Shunem, The Shunammite becomes a Shulamite. In other words, Shlomo. She becomes the property of Solomon, a Shulamite.
Because she was from the tongue of Shunem.
Michael, I have one last question, please. In talking about these generations, and we get to the 46th maidservant / cubit, must be someone special. Do you think there's anything prophetically as far as the numbers here of the generations that would indicate the return of Yahushua as far as the numbers prophetically?
Well, as much as I would like it to be, it ends while he was living. So those generations, they go to his birth. But as we know, he died without ever marrying. So there we are, stuck with these generations, these maidservants, these cubits, taking us all the way there. But alas, Jesus never marries. So where is his bride? Well, that answer comes up in the book of Revelations. He has a bride class, 144,000 that he marries. There is your answer. They are the cubits. They are the final cubits. So if I knew whenever Revelation took place, I could give you a prophetic time period. I could tell you when Armageddon would come, when the end of times would come. But as Jesus says, nobody knows the day or the hour, only the Father knows. Not even I know. Jesus didn't know. I don't know how I could know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm sure other students have questions now.
Sure.
Terry, we had the questions that Christy had, but her audio is not working well. So she wanted to ask, why would Ruth get a double portion? And she mentioned that she received Naomi and her dead husband's inheritance.
Well, Ruth didn't get a double portion. Now, remember, Boaz is quite a finagler. He knows Hebrew law, and he's an elder at the gate. So he knows all the little loopholes and how to design it in such a way that it would make it difficult for this kinsman redeemer that was first in line to not want Ruth. As a matter of fact, he stops at a certain point. He stops his negotiations. But Boaz could have gone further. He could have added one more detail and then yet another detail and yet another detail. But it was enough. So here's how Boaz designed it. The death of the husband meant that it went to the sons. After the death of the sons, it went back to Naomi or their wives. But only one wife went back. So whenever Ruth went back, if they accept her as a true proselyte, that like she had become a Jew, and of course she had become a Jew, well, then she would be in line for that. But since that was disputable because she was a Moabite and she didn't qualify till the 10th generation as a citizen, Boaz cleverly put it back on Naomi. And so that was the only issue in the negotiation, that Naomi had possession of the son's inheritance, both of them. So that's why it looks like a double portion, but it is in fact not technically a double portion.
So here Ruth was gaining Naomi's side of the family, but she also gave Boaz's side of the family. So that appears to be, she got Boaz and Naomi's. So
actually, I think the question is the two sons, and that would be a double portion.
Right.
So it makes it look as though Ruth received some sort of honorific double portion, but that's never said specifically in the book of Ruth. Actually, Boaz gets nothing. Whenever he bought the legal right, he did not get the land because he bought it so that the name could be reproduced from the deceased husband. So that's why the first guy in line would have no part of it, because what's in it for him? It's like he pays for it, but then the inheritance goes to whoever Ruth gives birth to. He gets nothing. So what's in it for him? He says, go ahead, Boaz, you idiot, you buy it.
Along that line with the double portion, if you can maybe just reference it with Ezekiel 47:13, which is in reference to Joseph getting a double portion, one of the gates of the city, and it says Jehovah himself is there. So that bears the name Joseph. So is it in reference to inheritance from the Creator?
Well, in this case, there is no double portion. There will be a double portion coming up after 10 generations have been exhausted. But bear in mind that poor Ruth, she's a Moabite. She will not gain citizenship for 10 generations, which includes King David. King David was not, I repeat, not a citizen. But who can stop Yahuwah's hand? If Yahuwah decides to make you king of Israel, citizen or not, just like who made Cyrus Mashiach for the Israelites, this foreign king. If Yahuwah decides he's going to do that, who can stop his hand? Yahuwah does whatever he wants to do. He's not under Hebrew law. But Ruth is under Hebrew law, Boaz is under Hebrew law, and until King David, so were the other descendants under Hebrew law. But by the time Jesus came along, or Yeshua, that's beyond the 10 generations. So he has long been liberated from that 10 generation curse of Moab.
Can you expand on what you said about David? That he's not a citizen?
And he is not a citizen. He's descended from, she's a Moabite.
Okay, got it. Because
And
generations.
yeah, they are the most cursed of all people, mostly because they are related to the Israelites. So it's one thing to make war with somebody. It's quite another to make war with your own family, which made it a bigger sin. It's like, don't forget, Lot was a worshiper of Yahuwah, along with Abraham. They were both worshipers of Yahuwah. It's just that, like, in time, since Lot's descendants were not Israelites, they did not get that primary blessing. That meant that they might descend into all forms of worship, including, obviously, they did worship Yahuwah, no problem there, but they also worshiped other gods too. They thought they could get away with what Aaron thought he could get away with. We just threw the gold in the fire and this golden calf came out. We're not getting rid of Yahuwah. We're just saying that this golden calf will help us better worship Yahuwah. Well, no doubt that's what the Moabites thought. Sorry, no prize for you. That won't work. Has to be exclusive worship.
True. Terry, did you write down Christy's other question?
I did not have her questions.
She's got it in the chat then.
Oh,
Oh, I know what it was. It was what was Ruth's dowry?
oh yeah.
Is there a dowry for Ruth?
Dowry is not a Hebrew cultural thing.
Okay.
There are no dowries with Hebrews. That is a foreign practice. Now, some of Solomon's wives, his foreign wives, brought dowries with them. But a Hebrew, there's no such thing.
Okay, very told. Thank you. Any more questions you have there, Terry, in front of you?
In reading this is my last one. In reading this again last night, it seems to indicate that when Naomi and Ruth came into Bethlehem, that they were not liking that. The citizens, the people in Bethlehem were kind of like in a, they didn't like that. They were, and I'm just wondering if that's so, and if that was so, is that because she was a widow and they felt like she was going to be a burden on them? Or is that true? Well, she was Just, can you explain that? It just seemed like they were in an uproar about that.
Well, remember, wealth is a relative thing. It's like Naomi's husband was a wealthy man, just like Boaz was a wealthy man. They were from a wealthy family. Whenever she says she's poor, you have to bear in mind what she came from. So she was not so poor that she had to sell her land. Notice that she came back and had land to sell. So she's just poorer than she was. So nobody had to take care of Naomi. As a matter of fact, Naomi could have come back and been just fine. She didn't even need Ruth. Naomi could have come back and sold her land. But once they did come back, selling the land was just a ploy to reconnect and get a grandchild for Naomi and a child for Ruth. They had money. You know, I should add one more thing too regarding a dowry. What did exist in Israel was a bride price. A man would pay for his bride, and that was described as a full wife. Now, if you didn't pay for your bride, that was called a half-wife or a concubine, which the literal translation is half-wife. So that's the difference between a concubine and a wife. Jacob paid for Rachel, and inadvertently he paid for Leah too, but he did not have to pay for their slave girls. They were given to him by Leah and Rachel. So they were referred to as concubines. But there's no shame in concubines. I mean, David had concubines, David had wives. He paid for his first wife with Goliath, the head of Goliath, I should say. So that's the difference between the Israelite culture. A man pays for his wife. There is no such thing as a dowry. That existed outside of the borders. And it's maybe not be a healthy thing, because whenever a woman comes with money, that's escape money. That means if she's not happy or it's not the way she wants it, she has escape money. Now she can just go back and leave Israel and not be in that burdensome marriage where they can only worship one God. So that's the difference between the cultures. There's the bride price and there's the dowry.
So interesting.
It is, really is.
And so just to support Michael's thinking on that, so Jacob here, he served 7 years for Rachel. In his eyes, it says it was just a few days. And so his labor was like payment. And also the Bible makes mention to the bride price. It had a few meanings. It did strengthen families, and it also established that a woman was also engaged, and she would be moving from the care and protection of the father to that of her husband. So,
and that bride price went to the father
yeah.
of the girl, which
Yeah.
meant she had value.
Yeah.
And it showed that the husband respected that she was a great contributor to the household that she came from, and to replace her would require money. So this is a man showing that he values this woman, and he's willing to pay for her the damages that he causes the family by taking her from that household, knowing that her value will come back many times when she comes into his value. So it is a form of respect to pay. There is no form of respect for a dowry.
Right. And so this Bible scholar Carl Myers says, and I quote, she said, a bride price might compensate the bride's family for the loss of a daughter's labor, which was important in agricultural families. And in those days, in the ancient world, they were based on an agricultural family.
We haven't talked about this, Alvin. Obviously, you've been doing some research. Good for you.
So it was a loss, the parent, so now the parent, because remember, Abraham sent out his servant, house servant there to look for a wife for Isaac. And then he came upon, was it Rebecca?
Rebecca, yes.
And she offered to water his camels. So imagine how much water one camel took. And he had a whole multitude of camels.
10, exactly.
Yeah, and she watered every one of them, so you can see how much that family would have missed out in an agricultural, pastoral kind of culture at that time. So it was a means of just compensating.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Boaz noticed about Ruth, is that she worked from dawn to dusk or whatever. She was a hard worker, capable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and 10 is a covenant number. The Hebrew letter equivalent is Yod, which is where we get the term, give your hand in marriage. It is a covenant arrangement. So whenever Abraham's servant showed up with 10 camels, there's the big clue as to why he's there. He's looking for a marriage covenant for his master's son, Isaac. So everywhere you see 10 in holy text, know that a covenant is not too far away. Thus, the 10 words or the 10 commandments and so forth, that was the prelude to the marriage agreement between the nation of Israel and Yahuwah. Once they agreed to the 10 words, that was the beginning of the marriage of the nation of Israel. And when they stopped paying their tithe, their 10th, that's whenever the marriage was dissolved in Isaiah 51 and Jeremiah 3:8. Yahuwah gave Israel a certificate of divorce.
That's so deep.
It's all so tied together. I mean, this is not big stuff. I'm not telling you anything that's secret or, like sacred knowledge or anything. This is something that anybody can discover if they will just read the Bible. It's there. It is a beautiful letter from our grandfather Yahuwah to us. He's doing his best to get his family back. There's a saying, and it's not a good saying, but there's a saying, the one who cares least in a relationship is the one that holds all the cards, because they can walk away. But unfortunately, Yahuwah cares the most. It's us that care the least. It's us that can walk away. And Yahuwah is invested. He cares. He hurts. He wants us. And he struggled through 66 books to get us. If we will just reach out the way Ruth did and just say, I want to be in the family. And that is the theme of the book of Ruth.
We pray this video enriches your loving and understanding of Yahuwah and His Word. Much has been hidden. Together, let's seek the restoration of all truth. We invite you to join the Hebrew Code Searching team. Please email us at HebrewCodeSearching@gmail.com to let us know about your interest. And we invite you to join our Facebook group, Code Searching Hebrews.
Love, truth, and revelation are vital in these last days. Headquartered from our farm in Curtistown, Hawaii, the Hebrew Restoration and Code Searching Ministry serves Yahuwah and the sheep from our Father's pasture. Please prayerfully consider a monthly donation at the Hawaii Restoration Farm. A link is provided for you in the description. Shalom, and may Yahuwah be with you. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe to our channel, and share the video. And thanks for watching.